James Curtis thought his job at Riverside Mental Health was routine paperwork and patient check-ins. But when he noticed the same 5 names disappearing from intake logs every month, only to reappear weeks later with completely different medical histories, he knew something was terribly wrong. The patients returned hollow-eyed and trembling, whispering about the white room and begging not to go back. Why were vulnerable patients vanishing from a secure facility? And what was happening in the basement wing that required his supervisor to carry 2 different sets of keys? When James finally accessed the restricted files, what he discovered about the hospital's research partnership made him question everything he thought he knew about medical ethics. The truth wasn't just shocking, it was criminal. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as James Curtis adjusted his tie and walked through the sterile corridors of Riverside Mental Health for the 3rd time that week. The smell of disinfectant mixed with something else, something stale and forgotten that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. "You're settling in well," Dr. Margaret Hollins had told him during his first week, her gray hair pulled back in, a severe bun that matched her no-nonsense demeanor. She was in her late 50s, with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every movement, every question. "Discretion is key in this line of work, James. Our patients deserve privacy, and some of their ... situations require extra confidentiality." James had nodded, understanding the need for patient privacy. What he hadn't understood was why certain files were kept in a separate locked cabinet in Dr. Holland's office, while the rest were stored in the standard filing system accessible to all staff. The intake coordinator position was exactly what James needed after his last job at the county clerk's office had been eliminated due to budget cuts. At 32, he couldn't afford to be picky about employment, and the state hospital offered decent benefits and steady hours. The work itself was straightforward: processing new patient admissions, updating medical records, coordinating with families and social workers. During his lunch break on Wednesday, James found himself sitting across from Rita Caldwell in the small employee cafeteria. Rita was a veteran nurse who'd worked at Riverside for 15 years, her graying brown hair and tired eyes telling the story of countless night shifts and difficult patients. She had a maternal quality that put patients at ease, but James noticed she grew visibly tense whenever management walked through the ward. "So what made you choose Riverside?" Rita asked, picking at her sandwich. The cafeteria was nearly empty, except for a few orderlies and maintenance staff. "Honestly, I needed the job," James replied with a self-deprecating smile. "But I've always been drawn to helping people, and this seems like meaningful work. Though I have to admit, some things here seem ... different." Rita's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Different how?" James glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Well, like that locked filing cabinet in Dr. Holland's office. I asked about it yesterday when I couldn't find the Mitchell file, and she seemed almost ... defensive. Said some patients require special handling, but didn't elaborate." The color drained from Rita's face. She set down her fork and leaned forward slightly. "James, listen to me. You're new here, and you seem like a good person. My advice? Focus on your assigned duties, and don't ask too many questions about things that don't concern you directly." "I wasn't trying to be nosy. I know," Rita interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But trust me on this. The less you know about certain ... procedures, the better off you'll be." Before James could respond, Rita had gathered her lunch tray and stood up. "I should get back to the ward. Mrs. Patterson in room 204 has been asking for her medication adjustment forms." James watched her hurry away, noting how she avoided eye contact with the administrative staff who just entered the cafeteria. Dr. Hollins was among them, deep in conversation with a man James didn't recognize, tall, well-dressed, with an expensive briefcase. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly, but James couldn't shake Rita's warning from his mind. As he organized patient intake forms, he found himself paying closer attention to the names, the admission dates, the discharge information. Most patients stayed for weeks or months, following predictable patterns of treatment and gradual improvement or stabilization, but there were inconsistencies. Small things that probably wouldn't matter to anyone else, but James had always been detail-oriented. Some patients were listed as transferred for specialized treatment with return dates that seemed oddly specific, always around the first of the following month. Others had gaps in their medical histories that didn't make sense. At 5 o'clock, James locked his desk drawer and prepared to leave. As he walked past Dr. Holland's office, he could see her through the partially open door, speaking on the phone in hushed tones. She was facing away from him, but her posture was tense, authoritative. Double quotes, ... The next group should be ready by the 15th, she was saying. Yes, we've confirmed their psychological profiles meet the criteria. James quickened his pace, not wanting to be caught eavesdropping. But as he pushed through the main entrance doors into the cool evening air, one question echoed in his mind. What criteria was she talking about? And why did Rita seem so afraid? 2 weeks into his job at Riverside Mental Health, James Curtis had developed a routine that felt almost meditative. Morning coffee in the staff room, review overnight incident reports, process new admissions, update patient records. The work was methodical, predictable, exactly what his life needed after months of unemployment. But routines had a way of revealing patterns, and James had always been good at spotting them. It started with the monthly roster reports. Every morning, James received an updated list of current patients, organized by ward and treatment status. Most names appeared consistently day after day, week after week. Chronic patients like Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez in the geriatric ward, or young Marcus Webb dealing with severe bipolar disorder. They were constants in the system. Then there were the others. James first noticed it on a Tuesday morning in his 3rd week. 5 names that had been on yesterday's roster were suddenly marked as transferred specialized treatment. Not discharged, not moved to another ward, transferred to an external facility for what the notes described as advanced therapeutic intervention. The names were Patricia Mooney, age 67, severe depression. Robert Chun, age 45, schizophrenia. Angela Torres, age 38, treatment-resistant anxiety disorder. David Kim, age 52, chronic depression with suicidal ideation. Michael Stevens, age 41, bipolar disorder with psychotic episodes. James pulled the previous month's records and felt his stomach tighten. Different names, but the same pattern. 5 patients, all with serious mental health conditions, all transferred on the 15th of the month for specialized treatment. He grabbed a yellow legal pad and started going back through the files month by month. The pattern was unmistakable. Every month, without fail, 5 patients were selected for transfer. Always on or around the 15th. Always patients with the most severe diagnosis. Always with estimated return dates of 4 to 6 weeks. When Dr. Hollins arrived at 10:30 for her daily rounds, James was ready with his questions. Dr. Hollins, I've been reviewing the transfer protocols and noticed we consistently send patients to this specialized facility. Could you tell me more about the program? Dr. Hollins paused in sorting through her mail, her sharp eyes focusing on James with an intensity that made him suddenly self-conscious. What exactly are you asking about? Mr. Curtis? The monthly transfers. For specialized treatment. I'm trying to understand the selection criteria so I can better prepare the paperwork. I see. Dr. Hollins set down her mail and folded her hands. These patients are selected for a highly advanced treatment program run by our research partners. It's cutting-edge therapy for treatment-resistant cases. patients who haven't responded to conventional methods. That sounds promising. Which facility handles the program? It's a private research institution that works closely with several state hospitals. The treatments are experimental, but we've seen remarkable results. She picked up her mail again, a clear signal that the conversation was over. The selection process is quite complex, involving multiple psychological evaluations and medical assessments. I handle those determinations personally. James nodded, but something in her tone bothered him. And the success rate? Dr. Hollins looked up again, and this time there was a warning in her expression. Mr. Curtis, I appreciate your thoroughness, but your role is administrative support. Patient treatment decisions are made by qualified medical professionals based on criteria you wouldn't understand. I suggest you focus on the tasks you were hired to perform. The dismissal was clear, but James couldn't let it go entirely. Of course, I was just hoping to better serve our patients by understanding all aspects of their care. Their care is excellent, Dr. Hollins said firmly. These partnerships allow us to offer treatments that wouldn't otherwise be available to state hospital patients. It's a privilege, not something to question. As Dr. Hollins gathered her things and headed toward the patient wards, James stared at his legal pad full of dates and names. Something about her explanation felt rehearsed, like she'd given it before to other curious employees. He spent his lunch break in the medical library, trying to research specialized treatment programs for severe mental illness. There were certainly experimental therapies being developed, new medications, innovative psychological interventions, even some controversial treatments involving brain stimulation or controlled environments. But when James searched for information about partnerships between state hospitals and private research facilities, he found very little. A few academic papers mentioned the need for more research funding and better access to experimental treatments for underserved populations, but nothing that matched what Dr. Hollins had described. That afternoon, while filing discharge summaries, James discovered something that made his hands shake slightly as he held the papers. Patricia Mooney, one of the 5 patients transferred just 2 weeks ago, was listed in the current roster again. But according to her file, she'd only been gone for 14 days, not the 4 to 6 weeks Dr. Hollins had mentioned. More troubling, Patricia's medical history had changed. Before her transfer, she'd been diagnosed with severe depression following the death of her husband. Now, her file included notations about medication compliance issues and resistance to therapeutic intervention, problems that had never been mentioned in her original intake assessment. James checked the other 4 transferred patients. 3 had similar discrepancies in their files. David Pyung's record now included references to aggressive behavior that his family had never reported. Angela Torres, who'd been a model patient according to her nurse's notes, was now described as uncooperative with treatment protocols. As James locked his desk that evening, one question dominated his thoughts. If this specialized treatment program was so successful, why were the patients coming back with worse behavioral problems than when they left? And why did their medical histories read like they'd been written by someone who'd never actually met them? The transport van arrived at Riverside Mental Health at 3:47 p.m. on a gray Thursday afternoon, pulling through the secure entrance with the routine efficiency of a delivery truck. James Curtis watched from his office window as 3 patients were helped out of the vehicle, their movements slow and unsteady. He recognized them immediately. Robert Chun, Angela Torres, and Thomas Brennan, 3 of the 5 patients who'd been transferred for specialized treatment. Exactly 4 weeks ago. They were scheduled to return today, according to the paperwork, but seeing them in person made James's stomach clench with unease. Something was very wrong. Robert Chun, who'd been animated and talkative during his intake interview 6 weeks ago, now moved like a man walking through thick mud. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes unfocused, and he required support from 2 orderlies just to walk the 50 feet from the van to the entrance. Angela Torres looked even worse. Her face was pale and drawn, with dark circles under her eyes that hadn't been there before. She kept touching her left arm, wincing as if in pain, but it was Thomas Brennan who made James abandon his desk and head toward the main entrance. The 70-year-old man had been admitted for severe depression following his wife's death, but he'd maintained his dignity and gentle demeanor throughout his initial stay. Now, Thomas moved with the shuffling gait of someone heavily medicated, his usually neat silver hair disheveled, and his clothes hanging loosely on a frame that seemed to have lost 20 pounds. James positioned himself near the nurse's station, pretending to review patient files while watching the intake process. Rita Caldwell was on duty, and he could see the concern in her face as she helped Angela Torres into a wheelchair. "How was your treatment, Mrs. Torres?" Rita asked gently, checking Angela's vital signs. Angela's response was barely audible. "The white room ... They kept us in the white room for so long. The injections made everything fuzzy, but we could still hear the others crying at night." Rita's face went pale. She glanced around quickly, then leaned closer to Angela. "What injections? Honey, what kind of treatment did you receive?" But before Angela could answer, Dr. Hollins appeared with 2 orderlies. "Mrs. Torres needs to rest," she announced firmly. "She's had an intensive treatment regimen and requires immediate stabilization. Take her to room 318 and ensure she receives her prescribed medication." As Angela was wheeled away, James noticed something that made his blood run cold. Her left arm, which she'd been favoring, bore several small bandages and what looked like needle marks, far more than would be expected from routine blood draws or 4 medications. Thomas Brennan was being processed at the adjacent station, and James found an excuse to walk past with a stack of intake forms. The elderly man's hands were shaking as he tried to sign his readmission paperwork. "Mr. Brennan," James said quietly, "welcome back. How are you feeling?" Thomas looked up, and for a moment his eyes seemed to clear. He grabbed James's wrist with surprising strength, his weathered fingers digging into James's skin. "They're not helping us," he whispered urgently. "They're using us. The White Room. The experiments. You have to—" "Mr. Brennan is clearly agitated," Dr. Hollins interrupted, appearing beside them with a small syringe. "He needs immediate sedation to prevent an episode." "No, please," Thomas pleaded, still gripping James's arm. "Tell someone. Tell them about the basement. Tell them what they're doing to us in the S." The sedative took effect quickly. Thomas's grip loosened, his eyes rolled back slightly, and his voice trailed off into incoherent mumbling. 2 orderlies lifted him into a wheelchair and began wheeling him toward the elevator. "Dr. Hollins," James said, trying to keep his voice casual, "Mr. Brennan mentioned a basement. I wasn't aware this facility had—" "Mr. Curtis," Dr. Hollins said sharply, disposing of the used syringe in a medical waste container. "Mr. Brennan is suffering from severe disorientation following his treatment. Patients often experience confusion and false memories as side effects of advanced therapeutic intervention. I suggest you don't encourage his delusions." James nodded, but he couldn't forget the clarity in Thomas's eyes, the desperation in his voice. "Of course. I was just concerned about his well-being." "Your concern is noted, but these patients require professional medical assessment, not questioning from administrative staff." Dr. Hollins's tone left no room for argument. "I trust you'll focus on your assigned duties and leave patient care to qualified personnel." As Dr. Hollins walked away, James found himself alone with Rita, who was completing Angela Torres's readmission paperwork. Her hands were trembling slightly as she wrote, "Rita." James said quietly, "What did you make of what Angela said about the White Room and injections?" Rita's pen stopped moving. She looked around nervously, then spoke in barely a whisper. "James, I've been a nurse for 20 years. I've seen every kind of psychiatric treatment, every medication, every side effect. What I just saw ... She shook her head. Those aren't the normal effects of any therapy I know about. What do you think? I think, Rita interrupted, that you should be very careful about the questions you ask around here. Very careful. That evening, James stayed late to review the readmission files for the 3 returned patients. The medical summaries from their specialized treatment were vague and filled with technical jargon that seemed designed to obscure rather than explain. Terms like experimental psychopharmacological intervention and advanced neurological monitoring appeared throughout, but there were no specific details about actual treatments or medications. More disturbing were the physical examination notes. All 3 patients showed signs of weight loss, dehydration, and what the reports euphemistically called minor injection site reactions. Robert Chun had developed a tremor in his left hand that hadn't been present before. Angela Torres showed signs of short-term memory impairment. Thomas Brennan had elevated liver enzymes consistent with exposure to unknown pharmaceutical compounds. As James locked the files away, Thomas's words echoed in his mind. They're using us. The question that kept him awake that night wasn't what kind of specialized treatment these patients had received. It was whether they'd been patients at all, or something else entirely. The night security guard at Riverside Mental Health made his rounds every 2 hours, a routine James Curtis had carefully observed over the past 3 weeks. At 11 p.m., the guard would check the main entrance and perimeter doors. At 1 a.m., he'd walk through the patient ward hallways. At 3 a.m., another perimeter check. The administrative offices were only checked once, around midnight, and then not again until morning shift arrival. James had volunteered for overtime inventory work, giving him legitimate reason to be in the building after hours. But tonight, his real purpose was to access patient files without the watchful eyes of Dr. Hollins and her staff. The fluorescent lights in the administrative wing cast harsh shadows as James made his way to the records room. His key card, which granted him access to patient files during regular hours, still worked at night, an oversight in security that he was counting on. The filing cabinets were organized chronologically, with the most recent admissions and discharges in the front sections. James pulled the folders for Patricia Mooney, Robert Chun, Angela Torres, David Kim, and Michael Stevens, the 5 patients who'd been transferred last month. Laying them out on the table under his small flashlight, he began comparing their pre-transfer and post-transfer medical histories. The discrepancies were even more pronounced than he'd initially realized. Patricia Mooney's original intake notes described her as cooperative, lucid, responsive to supportive therapy following grief counseling. Her post-transfer summary painted a completely different picture. Patient exhibits resistance to medication, compliance, episodes of confusion, requires increased monitoring for self-harm behaviors. But it was the medical test results that made James's hands shake as he photographed the documents with his phone. Before her transfer, Patricia's blood work showed normal levels across the board, typical for a 67-year-old woman with depression. After her return, her labs revealed elevated liver enzymes, abnormal kidney function, and traces of compounds that the lab reports couldn't identify. Robert Chun's file was even more disturbing. His original psychological evaluation noted him as oriented, communicative, no signs of cognitive impairment despite auditory hallucinations. The post-transfer notes described significant memory deficits, reduced motor function, requires assistance with basic daily activities. James photographed every page, his phone's camera flash seeming unnaturally bright in the darkened room. As he worked, a pattern emerged that chilled him to the bone. Every single transferred patient showed signs of physical deterioration, cognitive decline, and exposure to unknown substances. Whatever this specialized treatment was, it was harming people, not helping them. A sound in the hallway made him freeze footsteps, steady and purposeful. James quickly closed the files and slipped them back into the cabinet, turning off his flashlight and ducking behind a desk. The footsteps passed by the records room without stopping, but his heart was pounding so hard he was sure anyone could hear it. After waiting 10 minutes in complete darkness, James decided to risk one more search. He needed to find information about this mysterious treatment facility, where it was located, who ran it, how patients were selected. Dr. Hollins kept her personal files in a locked cabinet in her office, but James had noticed she sometimes left routine paperwork on her desk. Dr. Hollins's office was at the end of the administrative hallway, its frosted glass door bearing her name in gold lettering. James's keycard wouldn't work here, but he'd observed that she often left her window slightly open for air circulation. The ground floor office backed up to a small courtyard that was hidden from the main parking areas. The window was indeed open, just wide enough for James to squeeze through. He landed softly on the carpeted floor, immediately noticing the smell of coffee and antiseptic that seemed to permeate everything in the hospital. Dr. Hollins's desk was meticulously organized, with patient files stacked neatly in correspondence, sorted by priority. But it was the business cards scattered across her desk blotter that caught James's attention immediately. Most were from other medical professionals, pharmaceutical representatives, and hospital suppliers. But one stood out, a thick, expensive-looking card with embossed lettering that read Meridian Research Solutions, with a logo featuring intertwined DNA helixes. James photographed the card, noting the address in a medical district about 30 miles away. Below the main contact information, someone had handwritten notes in Dr. Hollins's precise script. Phase 2 trials, depression anxiety cohort, payment schedule net 30, next delivery 15th. Next delivery. The phrase made James's stomach turn. These weren't patients being sent for treatment. They were being delivered like packages. Manila folder marked confidential MRS only sat in Dr. Hollins's inbox. James opened it carefully, finding correspondence between Dr. Hollins and someone named Dr. Alexander Reeves at Meridian Research Solutions. The letters discussed subject selection criteria, informed consent protocols, and acceptable mortality rates. One particular exchange made James's blood run cold. Dr. Hollins, the Phase 2 trials for compound MRS-447 require subjects with severe depression who have shown resistance to conventional SSRIs. We need 10 subjects for the 6-week trial period. Compensation is $50,000 per subject, with an additional $10,000 bonus for subjects who complete the full protocol. As discussed, subjects with minimal family contact are preferred to reduce complications. Dr. Reeves. The response from Dr. Hollins was equally damning. Dr. Reeves, I can provide the requested subjects from our long-term care population. These patients have been unresponsive to standard treatments and have limited outside contact. I've selected candidates based on your criteria and will have them ready for transport on the 15th as scheduled. Please ensure the consent documentation appears legitimate for our records. Hollins. James photographed every page, his hands trembling with each flash. The final document in the folder was a financial summary showing payments totaling over $2.3 million over the past 18 months. At the bottom, a note in red ink, mortality rate holding at 12%, within acceptable parameters. 12%. These people were dying, and Dr. Hollins was treating it like an acceptable business expense. As James prepared to leave through the window, he spotted one more item that made him pause. An appointment calendar on Dr. Hollins's desk showed a meeting scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. Dr. Reeves, MRS, final selection, next cohort. The next group of patients was being chosen. 5 more vulnerable people were about to be sold to Meridian Research. Solutions for experiments that had a 12% chance of killing them. James climbed back through the window and made his way to the parking lot, his mind racing. He had evidence now: photographs, documents, financial records. But who could he trust? The hospital administration was clearly involved, and he had no way of knowing how deep the corruption went. As he drove home through the empty streets, one question haunted him. How many patients had already died in that 12% mortality rate? And how many more would die if he didn't find a way to stop this? The staff parking lot at Riverside Mental Health was nearly empty at 7 a.m. when Rita Caldwell intercepted James Curtis beside his Honda Civic. She'd clearly been waiting for him, her nurse's scrubs wrinkled from the night shift, dark circles under, her eyes that spoke of sleepless hours. "We need to talk," she said without preamble, glancing nervously toward the hospital entrance. "Not here. Meet me at Denny's on Route 9 in 20 minutes. Come alone." Before James could respond, Rita had hurried to her own car and driven away, leaving him standing in the parking lot with a growing sense of unease. The photographs on his phone from last night's investigation felt like they were burning a hole in his pocket. Did Rita know what he'd discovered? Was this a trap? 20 minutes later, James found Rita in a corner booth at the nearly empty Denny's, nursing a cup of coffee with hands that shook slightly as she lifted it to her lips. She'd chosen a table with a clear view of both entrances and the parking lot, the behavior of someone who'd learned to be constantly watchful. "I saw you leave the hospital at 3:30 a.m. last night," Rita said as James slid into the booth across from her. "The security cameras in the parking lot recorded your car. Dr. Hollins reviews those recordings every morning." James felt his stomach drop. "Rita, I can explain." "Don't." She held up a hand to stop him. "Whatever you found in those files, whatever you think you know about what's happening at Riverside, you need to forget it. Right now. Today." "I can't do that. People are being hurt." "Rita, the patients who come back from that treatment program are lucky to come back at all," Rita finished, her voice barely above a whisper. She leaned forward, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. "James, you have no idea what you're dealing with." The previous intake coordinator, David Chun, started asking the same questions you're asking, started noticing the same patterns. "What happened to him?" Rita's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Officially? He was terminated for performance issues and failure to maintain professional boundaries. Unofficially? David came to me 3 days before he disappeared, terrified out of his mind. He'd found financial records, photographs, documentation of what they were really doing to those patients. And David's car was found at the bottom of Miller's Pond 2 weeks after he was fired. Single vehicle accident, they said. Lost control on a rainy night." Rita's voice cracked slightly. "David was the most careful driver I knew. Never had so much as a parking ticket in 15 years. The coffee in James's cup had gone cold, but he couldn't have swallowed it anyway." "You think they killed him?" "I think David knew too much, and I think you're following the exact same path." Rita reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope, sliding it across the table. "Before David died, he gave me copies of everything he'd found. I've been too scared to do anything with it, but maybe, maybe it's time." James opened the envelope carefully. Inside were photographs of documents similar to what he'd seen the night before, but these went back almost 2 years. Financial records showing payments from Meridian Research Solutions totaling over $4 million. Patient transfer logs with mortality notations. And most damning of all, a series of emails between Dr. Hollins and someone identified only as FM, discussing the disposal of subjects who experienced adverse outcomes. "FM?" James asked. "Frank Morrison, hospital administrator. He's the one really running this operation. Dr. Hollins is just the medical front." Rita's hands were trembling as she spoke. "Morrison has gambling debts, connections to some very dangerous people. Word is he needed money fast, and Meridian Research offered him a way to make it using our patient population. James flipped through more photographs, his horror growing with each image. There were spreadsheets tracking patient deaths, like inventory shrinkage. Medical reports describing symptoms that sounded like torture rather than treatment. Financial projections estimating they could process up to 200 subjects per year while maintaining acceptable mortality parameters. Rita, we have to take this to the police, the FBI, someone. With what? Copies of documents that could have been faked? Accusations against a respected hospital administrator and a licensed physician? Rita shook her head. David tried that. He contacted the state health department, the medical licensing board, even the local police. Know what happened? Morrison got a heads up about every inquiry David made. The corruption goes deeper than just our hospital. James felt trapped, like the walls of the diner were closing in around him. So what do? Just let them keep murdering people? We survive, Rita said firmly. We keep our heads down, do our jobs, and hope they don't notice us. That's the only way to stay alive in this situation. I can't do that, not after what I've seen. Rita reached across the table and grabbed James's hand with surprising strength. Listen to me very carefully. You have a choice to make right now. You can walk away from this request to transfer, find another job, forget what you've learned, and live to see your next birthday. Or you can keep digging, keep asking questions, and end up like David Chun. James looked down at the photographs. Spread across the table, images of human beings reduced to experimental subjects, their lives treated as acceptable losses in someone's profit margin. What about Thomas Brennan, Angela Torres? All the others who are still alive, don't we owe them something? We owe them the truth being told by someone who can actually do something about it, and that's not us. Rita began gathering the photographs back into the envelope. James, I've worked at Riverside for 15 years. I've seen things that would give you nightmares. But I've also seen what happens to people who try to be heroes in a system this corrupt. As Rita prepared to leave, she turned back to James with one final warning. Dr. Hollins is having lunch with Morrison this afternoon. I heard them discussing the new employee situation. They know you were in those files last night, and they're deciding what to do about it. James watched Rita walk to her car, feeling more alone than he'd ever felt in his life. The envelope of evidence sat on the table in front of him, representing two choices, his safety or his conscience. The question was whether he could live with either decision. James Curtis spent the rest of his shift in a haze of anxiety and indecision, Rita's warning echoing in his mind alongside the images of those damning documents. By 6 p.m., most of the day staff had gone home, leaving the hospital in the capable hands of the skeleton night crew. James had stayed late, ostensibly to catch up on paperwork, but really because he needed time to think. The administrative wing was quiet, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of patient care from the residential floors. James was organizing intake files when he heard the distinctive click of high heels in the hallway. Dr. Hollins, making her evening rounds as she did every night before leaving. Something compelled him to follow her. James waited until Dr. Hollins had passed his office and quietly stepped into the hallway. She was walking toward the north wing of the building, an area James had never had reason to visit. He stayed far enough behind to avoid detection, using the natural shadows cast by the overhead lighting to conceal his movement. Dr. Hollins stopped at what appeared to be a maintenance door marked "Authorized personnel only, basement access." James watched from around a corner as she produced not one, but two different sets of keys. The first unlocked the door itself. The second was used on what looked like a separate security panel beside the doorframe. The door opened, revealing a staircase leading downward. Dr. Hollins disappeared into the basement, and James could see light emanating from below. After a moment of hesitation, He crept closer to the open doorway. The basement level was nothing like the rest of Riverside Mental Health. Instead of the worn carpeting and institutional paint of the upper floors, this area had the sterile, clinical appearance of a high-end medical facility. The walls were pristine white, the flooring was polished concrete, and the lighting was the bright, shadowless illumination of an operating theater. James descended the first few steps, staying close to the wall and moving as quietly as possible. He could hear voices now, Dr. Hollins speaking to someone else, their conversation muffled but urgent. At the bottom of the staircase, a long corridor stretched in both directions, lined with doors that had small observation windows. His heart nearly stopped when he looked through the first window. The room beyond contained hospital beds arranged in neat rows, each occupied by a patient connected to IV drips and monitoring equipment. But these weren't the standard patients from the floors above. James recognized several faceless patients who were supposed to have been transferred weeks ago to the mysterious specialized treatment facility. Patricia Mooney lay in the nearest bed, her face gaunt and pale, connected to multiple four lines that fed clear liquids into her veins. Her eyes were open but unfocused, staring at the ceiling with the blank expression of someone heavily sedated. Beside her bed, a chart showed dates, dosages, and notations that looked more like a laboratory experiment than medical treatment. In the next bed, Michael Stevens, who'd been transferred over a month ago, showed visible signs of physical deterioration. His hair had fallen out in patches, his skin had a grayish pallor, and his breathing was labored. The chart at the foot of his bed was marked with red warning symbols and phrases like adverse reaction, organ stress, and discontinue if subject expires. James moved to the next window, his hands shaking as he tried to process what he was seeing. This room contained different patients in various stages of what could only be described as human experimentation. Some were conscious but restrained, their eyes wide with terror. Others appeared to be unconscious or comatose, connected to machines that monitored vital signs and brain activity. The sound of approaching footsteps sent James scrambling back toward the staircase, but he could hear Dr. Hollins's voice getting closer. He ducked into a supply alcove, pressing himself against the wall and hoping the shadows would conceal him. The new batch should be ready for Phase 2 trials next week, Dr. Hollins was saying to someone James couldn't see. Meridian wants to accelerate the timeline for the neurological compounds, but I'm concerned about the mortality rate in the current cohort. That's acceptable losses, a male voice replied, one James didn't recognize. Dr. Reeves is more concerned about FDA approval, timelines than individual subject outcomes. We need data, and we need it fast. I understand the pressure, but if we lose too many subjects too quickly, it becomes difficult to explain to families and social workers. We've already had inquiries about several patients who were supposed to return last month. James held his breath as the two figures passed his hiding spot. The man with Dr. Hollins was tall and well-dressed, carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of expensive suit that suggested serious money. He had the cold, calculating demeanor of someone who viewed human suffering as an acceptable business expense. That's why we need to be more selective about our subjects, the man continued. Patients with minimal family contact, limited social connections. The indigent, the elderly, the chronically ill who won't be missed if they disappear. Morrison has been pushing for higher volume, but I think we need to focus on quality over quantity, Dr. Hollins replied. The last batch from the geriatric ward didn't respond well to the experimental compounds. 3 subjects expired within the first week. James felt sick to his stomach. They were talking about human beings like laboratory animals, calculating acceptable death rates and discussing how to select victims who wouldn't be missed by society. The voices faded as Dr. Hollins and her companion moved further down the corridor. James waited several more minutes before carefully making his way back toward the staircase. As he passed the observation windows, he tried to memorize the faces of the patients he could see, committing their names and conditions to memory. In the final room, he saw something that nearly made him cry out in shock. Thomas Brennan, the elderly man who'd tried to warn him just days ago, was strapped to a hospital bed with restraints around his wrists and ankles. His eyes were open and alert, and when he saw James's face in the window, he began mouthing words. Desperately. "Help us," Thomas was saying, his lips moving frantically. "Help us, please." James pressed his hand against the window, wanting to break through the glass and free Thomas immediately. But he could hear footsteps returning, and he knew that getting caught now would mean certain death, not just for him, but for any chance these patients had of being rescued. He made his way back up the staircase as quietly as possible, his mind reeling from what he'd witnessed. This wasn't a specialized treatment program. It was a human experimentation facility, hidden in the basement of a state mental health hospital. Vulnerable patients were being used as test subjects for experimental drugs, with mortality rates. That would make Nazi physicians proud. As James reached his office and gathered his things to leave, one thought dominated his mind. He now had proof of what was happening at Riverside, but he also knew that Dr. Hollins and her associates were willing to kill to protect their secret. The question was whether he could expose them before they decided he knew too much to live. James Curtis arrived at work the next morning with dark circles under his eyes and a stomach that churned with every step toward the administrative wing. The images from the basement haunted him. Thomas Brennan's desperate plea for help, the rows of unconscious patients connected to experimental IV drips, the casual way Dr. Hollins had discussed acceptable mortality rates. He'd spent the night researching Meridian Research Solutions online, finding only a professional website with vague descriptions of cutting-edge pharmaceutical development and innovative clinical trials. The company's executives were listed, including Dr. Alexander Reeves as chief medical officer, but there was no mention of partnerships with state hospitals or experimental programs involving vulnerable populations. At 10:30 a.m., James was updating patient admission records when he heard Dr. Hollins's voice from her office, speaking more loudly than usual. Her door was slightly ajar, and something in her tone, urgent, almost agitated, made him stop typing and listen. "I understand the pressure from your investors, Dr. Reeves, but we cannot accelerate the timeline without increasing our risk exposure," Dr. Hollins was saying. "The current Phase 2 trials for MRS-447 have already produced a 15% mortality rate. If we add 10 more subjects this month, as you're requesting, we're looking at potential losses that will be difficult to explain." James quietly moved closer to her office, positioning himself near the doorway where he could hear clearly while appearing to work on filing cabinets. His hands trembled as he pretended to organize documents, every word of the conversation burning itself into his memory. "Dr. Reeves, I appreciate the urgency, but you have to understand my position," Dr. Hollins continued. "I have state inspectors, family members, and social workers asking questions about patient outcomes. 3 families have already contacted our ombudsman about relatives who were supposed to return from specialized treatment weeks ago." There was a pause as she listened to the response from the other end of the line. "Yes, I understand that Phase 3 trials require larger subject pools, but we need to be more strategic about selection criteria. I suggest we focus on patients from the long-term care wing, individuals with advanced dementia, minimal family contact, and limited life expectancy. Their disappearance can be more easily attributed to natural disease progression." James felt his blood run cold. They were planning to target the most vulnerable patients in the hospital, elderly people with dementia who couldn't advocate for themselves and whose deaths might go unnoticed by overwhelmed family members. "The payment structure is acceptable," Dr. Hollins continued, "but I need assurance that any subjects who experience severe adverse reactions will be handled discreetly." Morrison has become concerned about disposal logistics, especially after the last incident with Subject 247B. Subject 247B. James realized with horror that they weren't even using names. Anymore, these were human beings reduced to experimental numbers in someone's research database. 10 subjects by month's end is feasible if we expand selection criteria, Dr. Hollins said, her voice taking on a businesslike efficiency that made James's skin crawl. I can provide 5 from the dementia ward, 3 from chronic depression cases with minimal social connections, and 2 from our indigent admissions. The total compensation of $750,000 should cover our operational costs and provide adequate incentive for continued cooperation. $750,000. James did quick math in his head. That was $75,000 per patient, suggesting that Meridian Research was paying premium rates for access to vulnerable test subjects who couldn't consent to experimental treatments. Dr. Reeves, I need your assurance that if any subjects require permanent disposal, your facility has adequate procedures in place. We cannot afford another situation like we had with David Chun, where outside parties become suspicious about missing persons. The mention of David Chun Ritta's colleague, who died in a suspicious car accident, confirmed James's worst fears. They weren't just conducting illegal medical experiments. They were eliminating anyone who threatened to expose their operation. The new intake coordinator has been asking questions, Dr. Hollins said, and James felt his heart stop. Morrison believes he may have accessed confidential files, and we're monitoring his activities closely. If he becomes a liability, we'll need contingency plans similar to what we implemented with Chun. James forced himself to remain calm, continuing to file documents with hands that were now shaking visibly. They knew he'd been investigating, and they were already planning how to eliminate him if necessary. I understand the timeline pressures, but remember that our success depends on maintaining the appearance of a legitimate psychiatric facility. State funding, accreditation, and regulatory oversight all require that we demonstrate positive patient outcomes. The subjects who return from trials need to appear sufficiently recovered to satisfy external audits. There was another pause as Dr. Hollins listened to something from Dr. Reeves. Yes, the experimental psychotropic compounds have been effective for that purpose. Subjects return with sufficient cognitive impairment to prevent them from reporting their experiences, while appearing to have responded positively to intensive therapy. The memory suppression effects typically last 3 to 6 months, which gives us adequate time to manage any complications. James realized that the patients who returned from specialized treatment weren't just physically damaged. They were being deliberately given drugs that suppressed their memories of the experimental procedures. Thomas, Brennan's desperate warning about the White Room and experiments represented a brief moment of clarity before the memory-suppressing medications took full effect. Dr. Reeves, I need to end this call. I have a staff meeting in 10 minutes, and we cannot afford to have these discussions overheard. Dr. Hollins's voice was moving closer to the door. Prepare the facility for the next cohort. I'll have the 10 subjects ready for transport on the 15th as scheduled. James quickly moved away from Dr. Hollins's office, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd heard. 10 more patients were going to be selected for deadly medical experiments within the next 2 weeks. People with dementia, depression, and other vulnerabilities were going to be subjected to procedures that had already killed 15% of previous test subjects. As he sat at his desk, pretending to work while processing the phone conversation, James realized that Rita had been wrong about one thing. They couldn't afford to keep their heads down and hope to survive. Dr. Hollins and Morrison were already planning to eliminate him as a potential threat, just as they'd eliminated David Chun. The only way to survive was to expose the entire operation before they could silence him permanently. Were 10 more lives hanging in the balance, and the selection process beginning soon. James knew he was running out of time to find someone who could stop Meridian Research Solutions and their partners at Riverside Mental Health. The question was whether anyone would believe his story before it was too late for him and for the next victims in their deadly experiment. That evening, James Curtis sat across from his girlfriend, Sarah Martinez, in their small apartment kitchen, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him like a physical force. Sarah was a social worker at the County Juvenile Center, someone who dedicated her career to protecting vulnerable people, and James knew she would understand the magnitude of what he'd uncovered, but telling her would also put her in danger. "You've been distracted all week," Sarah said, setting down her coffee cup and studying his face. "Something's wrong at the hospital, isn't it?" James had rehearsed this conversation in his mind during the drive home, but now that the moment had arrived, he struggled to find the right words. How do you tell someone you love that you've stumbled into a conspiracy that involves murdering vulnerable patients for profit? "Sarah, what I'm about to tell you, it's going to sound impossible, but I need you to listen and help me figure out what to do." Over the next hour, James laid out everything he'd discovered: the pattern of patient transfers, the basement laboratory, the financial records, Dr. Hollins's phone conversation with Meridian Research Solutions. Sarah's face grew paler with each revelation, her social worker's instincts recognizing the systematic abuse and exploitation he was describing. "My God, James," she whispered when he finished, "this is murder. This is systematic genocide of mentally ill patients." "I know, and they're planning to select 10 more patients within the next 2 weeks. People with dementia who can't advocate for themselves, patients whose families might not notice if they disappear." Sarah stood up and began pacing the small kitchen, her mind already working through the implications. "You have to report this immediately. FBI, State Attorney General, media, everyone who can stop this." "With what proof? Photographs I took illegally during a break-in? Copies of documents that could be dismissed as forgeries? A story about a basement laboratory that no one else has official access to?" James ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "They've covered their tracks carefully, Sarah, and they have connections. Morrison got advance warning every time David Chun tried to report them." "David Chun?" "The previous intake coordinator. He discovered the same things I did and tried to go through official channels. 2 weeks later, he was dead in a car accident that everyone who knew him says was impossible." Sarah stopped pacing and looked directly at James. "So what are you saying? That we just ignore this? Let them keep murdering people?" "I'm saying I don't know how to stop them without getting myself killed in the process. And now that I've told you, I've put you at risk too." The apartment fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. Sarah sat back down and reached across the table to take James's hands. "When I was 8 years old," she said quietly, "my little brother, Miguel, went missing from a playground while my mom was talking to another parent. We searched for hours before finding him trapped in an old drainage pipe, scared and hurt but alive. My mom always said that the worst part wasn't the fear that something terrible had happened. It was the few minutes when she considered giving up the search, because it seemed hopeless." James squeezed her hands, understanding where she was going with the story. "James, somewhere in that hospital are people who are trapped and scared and depending on someone to not give up searching for them. Thomas Brennan is counting on you. Those 10 patients who are about to be selected are counting on you, even though they don't know it yet. But what if I can't save them? What if all I accomplish is getting us both killed? Then we'll have died, trying to do the right thing, instead of living with the knowledge that we could have saved innocent people and chose not to." James felt a surge of love for Sarah, her unwavering moral compass, her refusal to accept compromise when human lives were at stake. It was one of the things that had drawn him to her initially, and now it was forcing him to confront his own ethical boundaries. Even if we decide to move forward, where do we start? Who can we trust? Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking. My supervisor at the juvenile center used to work for the state attorney general's office. She handled cases involving institutional abuse and has connections with federal investigators who specialize in medical fraud. If anyone would know how to approach this safely, it would be her. And if your supervisor is connected to Morrison's network? If she tips them off the way other officials did when David Chun tried to report, then we find another way. But James, we have to try something. Every day we wait is another day that patients are being subjected to experimental torture. James looked around their small apartment at the life they'd built together, the future they'd planned, the safety and normalcy they were about to sacrifice. But he also thought about Thomas Brennan's desperate eyes pleading for help through that basement window, about Patricia Mooney unconscious in a hospital bed while experimental chemicals poisoned her system. There's something else, James said reluctantly. During Dr. Hollins's phone call today, she mentioned that they're monitoring my activities and considering me a potential liability. They're already planning how to eliminate me if I become a threat. Sarah's face went white. All the more reason to act quickly. If they're planning to hurt you anyway, we might as well make sure your sacrifice accomplishes something. Our sacrifice, James corrected. If we do this, we're both targets. I understand that. Sarah's voice was steady, determined. But I also understand that there are innocent people being murdered in the basement of your hospital, and we might be the only ones who can stop it. James made his decision in that moment, not because he was brave or heroic, but because Sarah was right. Some things were more important than personal safety. Okay, tomorrow, you contact your supervisor and see if she can connect us with federal investigators. I'll continue documenting everything I can at the hospital, but I'll be more careful about not getting caught. What about the 10 patients who are about to be selected? I'll try to identify them before the transfer date and find a way to warn their families or social workers. Maybe if enough people start asking questions, it will disrupt their timeline. As they worked out the details of their plan, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was signing their death warrants. But he also couldn't live with himself if he remained silent while vulnerable patients were systematically murdered for profit. The next morning, James arrived at Riverside Mental Health with a new sense of purpose and a growing awareness that his time was running out. Every interaction with Dr. Hollins and Morrison felt like a delicate dance, where one wrong step could trigger the same fate that had befallen David Chun. But somewhere in the basement of the hospital, Thomas Brennan and others were counting on him to not give up the search, no matter how hopeless it seemed. James Curtis spent 2 days carefully observing the security routines and patient schedules before he found his opportunity to speak with Thomas Brennan. The elderly man had been moved from the basement laboratory back to the general population. Calculated move by Dr. Hollins to maintain the illusion that he'd received successful treatment. Thomas was in the day room during afternoon recreation time, sitting alone in a wheelchair near the windows. The memory-suppressing drugs were clearly affecting him. His eyes held the glassy, unfocused look of someone fighting through a pharmaceutical fog, but James had noticed moments of clarity when tossed. Thomas seemed to remember fragments of his experience. James approached with a clipboard, making it appear that he was conducting routine administrative checks. The day room was supervised by a single orderly who was more interested in his phone than monitoring patient interactions. Mr. Brennan, James said quietly, sitting in the chair beside Thomas's wheelchair. How are you feeling today? Thomas turned, slowly blinking several times as if trying to bring James into focus. For a moment, his expression was blank. Then something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of recognition and fear. You're the one from the office, Thomas whispered, his voice hoarse and uncertain. You tried to help me before they took me back. I'm here to help you now, James said, keeping his voice low and his posture casual. But I need you to tell me what happened during your treatment. What did they do to you? Thomas's hands began to shake, and he gripped the arms of his wheelchair. The drugs, ... They give us drugs to make us forget, but sometimes, at night, pieces come back. Terrible pieces. Tell me what you remember. Thomas looked around nervously, then leaned closer to James. The white room. That's what we called it. Everything was white, the walls, the ceiling, the chilling, machines. They would bring us down in groups of 5 or 6, strap us to tables with leather restraints. James felt his stomach clench, but he forced himself to remain calm and encouraging. What kind of procedures did they perform? Injections. So many injections. Thomas rolled up his sleeve, revealing his forearm. Despite weeks of healing time, James could still see the faint marks of multiple needle punctures, far more than any legitimate medical treatment would require. Different colored liquids. Some burned going in, made us scream. Others made everything go black, like falling into a deep well. Did they tell you what the injections were for? Thomas shook his head, then winced as if the movement caused pain. Men in white coats would take notes, measure our responses. Heart rate, blood pressure, brain activity. They attached electrodes to our heads, monitored everything on computer screens. How many patients were with you? Started with 12 in my group. From different hospitals, different states. Sarah from Connecticut, Michael from Pennsylvania, an old woman named Dorothy from somewhere in Ohio. Thomas's voice cracked. They didn't all make it. James leaned forward, dreading the answer to his next question. What happened to them? Sarah started convulsing during the 3rd week. They gave her injection after injection, but she couldn't stop shaking. Blood started coming from her mouth. Her eyes rolled back. Thomas was crying now, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. They covered her with a sheet and wheeled her away, told us she'd been transferred to a different facility. And the others? Michael's heart stopped during one of the brain monitoring sessions. Dorothy developed some kind of infection. Her skin turned yellow. She couldn't keep food down. By the end of the 6 weeks, only 5 of us were still alive. James felt sick, but he needed to hear everything. Did you ever see who was in charge? Anyone who might have been from the pharmaceutical company? Thomas nodded slowly. Dr. Reeves came twice a week. Tall man, expensive clothes, spoke with a slight accent European, maybe German. He would review our charts, examine us like we were laboratory animals, called us by numbers, never names. What numbers? I was 347C, Sarah was 348. A. They tattooed the numbers on our wrists with temporary ink that faded after a few weeks. Thomas pushed up his sleeve again, and James could see the faint outline of numbers that had been deliberately obscured. Thomas, this is important. Do you remember anything about how you were selected for the program? Why you specifically? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, struggling against the memory-suppressing drugs. Dr. Hollins came to see me about a month before the transfer. Asked about my family, whether anyone visited regularly. When I told her my daughter lived in California and only called once a month, she seemed pleased. They were targeting patients with minimal family contact. Yes, all of us in the program were alone, forgotten. People's society wouldn't miss if we disappeared. Thomas gripped James's arm with surprising strength. That's why you have to stop them. The next group? They're selecting the next group soon. How do you know? I overheard Dr. Hollins talking to the orderlies yesterday. They're preparing beds. In the basement again. 10 beds this time, not 12. They said they learned from their mistakes, want to improve their survival rate. James felt a chill run down his spine. The new group was being prepared already, and they were planning to be more careful about keeping the test subjects alive, not out of compassion, but to improve their experimental data. Thomas, would you be willing to speak to federal investigators? To testify about what happened to you? Thomas's eyes widened with fear. They said if we ever talked about the treatment, they would bring us back, make us disappear permanently. I've seen what they're capable of. I can't. I understand, but there might be a way to protect you if we can expose the whole operation. Before Thomas could respond, James noticed Dr. Hollins entering the day room with 2 orderlies. She was scanning the area methodically, her gaze stopping when she spotted James sitting with Thomas. "Mr. Brennan needs his afternoon medication," Dr. Hollins announced, approaching their table with determined steps. "Mr. Curtis, I wasn't aware you had clinical duties with our patients. Just conducting routine follow-up interviews for administrative purposes," James replied, standing and gathering his clipboard. "Mr. Brennan was telling me how much the specialized treatment helped him." Thomas looked terrified, his hands shaking. As the orderlies moved to either side of his wheelchair, "Please," he whispered to James, so quietly that only he could hear, "don't let them take me back to the White Room." As the orderlies wheeled Thomas away, James caught Dr. Hollins studying him with a calculating expression. "Mr. Curtis, I'd like to see you in my office in 10 minutes. We need to discuss your role boundaries and appropriate patient interaction protocols." James watched Thomas disappear down the hallway, knowing that their conversation had been discovered and that both of their lives were now in immediate danger. The selection of the next 10 victims was accelerating, and James was running out of time to save them or himself. The meeting with Dr. Hollins had been a thinly veiled threat, disguised as administrative guidance. She'd questioned James about his conversation with Thomas Brennan, emphasized the importance of maintaining professional boundaries, and reminded him that patient confidentiality violations could result in immediate termination and criminal charges. But what unsettled James most was her parting comment. "Mr. Curtis, I hope you understand that some information, once learned, carries significant responsibility. I trust you'll handle that responsibility wisely." That evening, James decided he needed concrete proof that would be impossible to dismiss or discredit. Thomas's testimony was compelling, but trauma victims under the influence of memory-suppressing drugs wouldn't be considered reliable witnesses. He needed documentation that clearly showed patients who were supposed to have been transferred were actually being held in the basement laboratory. The security office at Riverside Mental Health was located on the ground floor, adjacent to the main reception area. James had noticed that the night security guard, an older man named Bill Stevens, often stepped outside for cigarette breaks that lasted 15 to 20 minutes. The office was equipped with a comprehensive digital surveillance system that recorded all areas of the hospital, including the basement levels. At 11:30 p.m., James watched from the stairwell as Bill Stevens headed outside for his routine smoke break. The security office door was left unlocked, a violation of protocol that James was counting on. He slipped inside, his heart pounding as he approached the bank of monitors and digital recording equipment. The surveillance system was more sophisticated than James had expected, with multiple camera feeds displaying real-time footage from throughout the hospital. More importantly, the digital storage system appeared to maintain recordings for at least 90 days, long enough to capture evidence of patients being taken to the basement and never returning. James navigated through the computer interface, searching for recordings from the dates when patients had been supposedly transferred for specialized treatment. He started with Patricia Mooney, who had been moved on October 15th, according to hospital records. She'd been picked up by transport vehicle at 2 p.m. and taken to an external treatment facility. The security footage told a different story. At 1:45 p.m. on October 15th, cameras showed Patricia being escorted by 2 orderlies toward the north wing, the same area where James had seen Dr. Hollins access the basement. The footage clearly showed Patricia being taken down the basement staircase, not to any transport vehicle. More damning, the cameras captured her being brought back upstairs 3 days later, unconscious on a gurney and covered with a white sheet. But Patricia Mooney's return wasn't to the general patient population. The footage showed her being taken to a small room in the administrative wing that James had never seen before, a room that appeared to be set up as a recovery area with medical equipment and monitoring devices. James fast-forwarded through several days of footage documenting Patricia's condition during her hidden recovery period. She appeared to be in a coma or heavily sedated state for nearly 2 weeks before being moved back to the basement. The cycle repeated: basement laboratory, recovery room, basement laboratory again. He searched for footage of other supposedly transferred patients and found the same pattern. Robert Chun, Angela Torres, David Kim, Michael Stevens all had been cycled through the basement laboratory multiple times over the course of several months, with recovery periods hidden in rooms that didn't appear on any hospital floor plans. It was the footage from the morgue area that made James's hands shake as he operated the computer controls. Several recordings showed gurneys covered with white sheets being wheeled from the basement to the hospital's morgue in the early morning. Hours. The timestamps corresponded to dates when patients had been reported as successfully completing treatment and being discharged to family members or care facilities. James found footage of Dr. Hollins and Morrison meeting with a man in an expensive suit, presumably Dr. Reeves from Meridian Research, in the morgue area. They were examining body bags and discussing logistics with the cold efficiency of people arranging a business transaction. One particularly damning recording showed Morrison handing Dr. Reeves a manila envelope while standing next to 3 body bags. The timestamp was from 6 weeks ago, exactly when Sarah from Connecticut, Michael from Pennsylvania, and Dorothy from Ohio would have died. According to Thomas Brennan's testimony, James used his phone to record portions of the security footage, focusing on the clearest evidence of patients being taken to unauthorized areas, hidden recovery rooms, and the morgue meetings. He documented dates, times, and identifying information that could be cross-referenced with official hospital records. As he prepared to leave the security office, James discovered one more piece of evidence that chilled him to the bone. The system maintained a log of when recordings had been accessed or deleted. Someone with administrative privileges had been systematically deleting footage related to patient transfers and basement activities, but they'd missed several backup files that were stored on secondary servers. The deletion log showed that footage had been removed within hours of David Chun's death, suggesting that Morrison and Dr. Hollins had been trying to eliminate evidence that might link them to his murder. James was copying the final pieces of evidence when he heard footsteps in the hallway outside the security office. Bill Stevens was returning from his cigarette break earlier than usual. James quickly closed the surveillance programs and moved toward the door, but he could hear the security guard's keys jingling as he approached. There was no way to leave the office without being seen. James looked around the small room desperately, spotting a supply closet in the corner. He squeezed inside just as Bill Stevens entered the security office, whistling softly and settling into his chair. Through the crack in the closet door, James could see the guard reviewing the camera feeds and making routine notations in his logbook. For 20 agonizing minutes, James remained hidden in the closet, his phone burning with the recorded evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy. Every sound seemed amplified: his breathing, the rustle of his clothes, the slight creak of the closet door. Finally, Bill Stevens received a call on his radio about a minor disturbance in the patient ward. He left the security office to investigate, giving James the opportunity to slip out and make his way to the parking lot. As James drove home through the empty streets, he reviewed the evidence he'd gathered. The security footage provided irrefutable proof that patients were being held in unauthorized areas, that bodies were being removed from the hospital morgue, and that hospital officials were meeting with outside parties to coordinate illegal activities. But he also knew that his time was running out. The meeting with Dr. Hollins, his conversation with Thomas Brennan, and now his unauthorized access to the security system had almost certainly been noticed. Morrison and Dr. Hollins would be accelerating their timeline to eliminate him as a threat. The question was whether Sarah's contact at the state Attorney General's office could act quickly enough to save the next group of patients, and whether James would live long enough to see justice served. The text message from Rita Caldwell arrived at 6:47 a.m., waking James from the first decent sleep he'd managed in days. Meet me at the old Riverside Cemetery on Maple Street. 7:30 a.m. Come alone. Urgent. James dressed quickly, his mind racing with possibilities. Had Rita discovered something new? Was she warning him about an immediate threat? Or worse, had Morrison and Dr. Hollins gotten to her, turning his only ally into a trap? The cemetery was shrouded in morning mist, its weathered headstones emerging from the fog like silent sentinels. James found Rita sitting on a bench near the back of the grounds, clutching a large shopping bag and looking over her shoulder every few seconds. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept, and her usually neat nurse's uniform was wrinkled and disheveled. "Thank God you came," Rita said as James approached. "I wasn't sure. After yesterday, I thought they might have already gotten to you. What happened yesterday?" Rita opened the shopping bag and began pulling out manila folders, photographs, and what appeared to be medical equipment. "Dr. Hollins called me into her office after your conversation with Thomas Brennan. She wanted to know if you'd been asking me questions about patient transfers or treatment protocols." "What did you tell her?" "I lied. Said you were just trying to do your job thoroughly and hadn't asked about anything unusual." Rita's hands were shaking as she organized the documents. "But James, she didn't believe me. I could see it in her eyes, that cold calculation she gets when she's planning something." Terrible. James sat beside Rita on the bench, studying the materials she'd brought. "What is all this?" "Everything David Chun gave me before he died, plus everything I've been documenting for the past 2 years. Rita's voice cracked with emotion. "I've been a coward, James. I've watched them murder innocent people and done nothing because I was too scared to act." The first folder contained photographs that made James's stomach turn. Images of patients in the basement laboratory, connected to experimental equipment and showing visible signs of distress. Some photos showed the same patients at different stages of their ordeal, healthy at the beginning, progressively more deteriorated over weeks of treatment. "I took these with a hidden camera during night shifts," Rita explained. "Dr. Hollins thought I was just making routine rounds, but I was documenting everything I could." James flipped through more photographs, recognizing several faces from the security footage he'd reviewed. But Rita's documentation went much deeper than what he'd been able to capture. She had close-up images of injection sites, monitoring equipment, and medical charts that clearly showed experimental drug protocols. "This patient here," Rita pointed to a photograph of an elderly woman connected to multiple 4 lines, "was Dorothy Westfield from the dementia ward. According to hospital records, she was discharged to family care in September. In reality, she died during the 3rd week of experimental trials. Thomas Brennan mentioned a Dorothy who died in the program. Same person. She developed liver failure. After repeated exposure to an experimental compound called MRS-447, I watched her die slowly over 4 days while Dr. Reeves took detailed notes about her symptoms." Rita wiped tears from her eyes. They listed her as a successful discharge and told her nephew she'd been moved to a private care facility in another state. The next folder contained financial records that dwarfed what James had discovered in Dr. Hollins's office. Bank statements showing regular payments for Meridian Research Solutions totaling over $6 million over 2 years. Expense reports for special medical supplies and consulting fees that clearly related to the experimental program. Morrison has been skimming money from the state hospital budget to fund equipment for the basement laboratory, Rita explained. He's created fake vendor accounts, inflated medical supply orders, and redirected pharmaceutical budgets to support the illegal research. But it was the final folder that contained the most devastating evidence. Medical records for over 200 patients who had been subjected to experimental procedures over the past 2 years. Detailed documentation of adverse reactions, organ failure, psychological trauma, and death rates that exceeded 20% for certain experimental compounds. Rita, this is incredible. This proves everything: the illegal experiments, the financial conspiracy, the systematic murder of vulnerable patients. There's more. Rita pulled a small digital recorder from the shopping bag. I've been recording conversations between Dr. Hollins and Morrison for the past 6 months. Discussions about patient selection, disposal methods, cover-up strategies. James. Listen to portions of the recordings, hearing Dr. Hollins and Morrison discussing patients, like laboratory animals, and calculating acceptable mortality rates with chilling casualness. One conversation specifically addressed plans for eliminating David Chun and making his death appear accidental. "Why are you showing me this now?" James asked. "Why not earlier?" Rita was quiet for a long moment, staring at the fog-covered cemetery around them. "Because I'm dying, James. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors say I have maybe 6 weeks left." The revelation hit James like a physical blow. "Rita, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I've kept it secret because I needed to keep working, needed to finish gathering evidence. But yesterday, when Dr. Hollins threatened you the same way she threatened David Chun, I realized I couldn't take this to my grave." Rita's voice was steady despite her tears. "These people are monsters, James. They've turned the mental health facility into a death camp, and they're planning to expand their operation to other hospitals." "Other hospitals?" Rita nodded, pulling out one final document. Correspondence between Morrison and administrators at 3 other state facilities. They're offering to share their experimental research program in exchange for access to more patient populations. Potentially thousands of vulnerable people could be subjected to these procedures. James felt overwhelmed by the scope of the conspiracy. What had started as questionable patient transfers at a single hospital was actually a pilot program for systematic experimentation on mentally ill patients across multiple states. "Rita, we have to get this evidence to federal authorities immediately. With your documentation and what I've gathered, we can try," Rita interrupted. "But you need to understand what we're up against. Morrison has connections in the state government, the medical licensing board, even local law enforcement. Dr. Reeves has pharmaceutical industry ties that reach into federal regulatory agencies. So what do you suggest?" Rita pulled a business card from her purse. "My cousin works for an investigative journalist at the Washington Post, someone who specializes in exposing medical fraud and institutional corruption. If we can get this story published, it becomes impossible for them to cover up or dismiss." James looked at the overwhelming evidence spread across the cemetery bench photographs. Financial records, medical documentation, audio recordings. This could work. Public exposure, federal investigation, criminal prosecutions. But James, once we release this information, we become immediate targets. They killed David Chun for much less than what we know. Are you prepared for that risk? James thought about Thomas Brennan's desperate plea for help, about the 10 patients who were about to be selected for the next round of experiments, about the hundreds of vulnerable people who could be saved if this conspiracy was exposed. "Yes," he said finally. "But Rita, you should get somewhere safe. Let me handle the journalist contact and no." Rita's voice was firm. "I've been a coward for 2 years, and I have 6 weeks to live. If I'm going to die anyway, I want it to mean something. I want it to save lives." As they prepared to leave the cemetery, Rita made one final revelation that changed everything. "James, there's something else you need to know about Dr. Hollins. She's not just participating in this conspiracy. She's being blackmailed into it." "What do you mean?" "Morrison discovered that she falsified patient records at her previous hospital to cover up a medical error that killed a child. He's been holding that over her head, forcing her cooperation with the experimental program. James stared at Rita in shock. Are you saying Dr. Hollins might be willing to help us expose Morrison and Meridian Research? I'm saying, Rita replied quietly, that even monsters sometimes want redemption. The revelation about Dr. Hollins changed everything. As James drove back to the hospital that morning, his mind raced with new possibilities. If Dr. Hollins was being blackmailed rather than willingly participating in the conspiracy, she might be their key to stopping Morrison and Meridian Research Solutions if they could approach her safely. But first, James needed to verify Rita's claim. The idea that Dr. Hollins might be a victim rather than a willing perpetrator seemed almost impossible given her cold efficiency in discussing patient deaths. Yet the way she'd hesitated during certain phone conversations, the stress lines around her eyes, the defensive posture when questioned, perhaps those weren't signs of guilt, but of someone trapped in an impossible situation. James spent his lunch break researching Dr. Hollins's previous employment. She'd worked at Children's Hospital in Boston before coming to Riverside 3 years ago. A careful search of medical malpractice records and news archives revealed a story that made his blood run cold. Dr. Margaret Hollins had been the attending physician when 8-year-old Timothy Morrison died during routine surgery. The child had an allergic reaction to anesthesia that wasn't noted in his medical records, leading to cardiac arrest and brain death. An investigation found that Dr. Hollins had failed to review the patient's complete allergy history and had altered records after the incident to cover up her oversight. Timothy Morrison, the same last name as Frank Morrison, the hospital administrator. James felt the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. Frank Morrison wasn't just blackmailing Dr. Hollins with random medical records, he was using his son's death. Leverage. The child who died because of Dr. Hollins's negligence was Morrison's own son, making this conspiracy deeply personal as well as financial. That afternoon, James found an opportunity to approach Dr. Hollins directly. She was reviewing patient files in her office during the shift change when most staff were off the floors. James knocked on her partially open door, his heart pounding as he prepared to either save lives or sign his own death warrant. Dr. Hollins, could I speak with you privately? It's about the patient transfer protocols. She looked up from her paperwork, and James was struck by how exhausted she appeared. The sharp, calculating woman he'd feared for weeks suddenly seemed older, more fragile. Mr. Curtis, I thought we'd addressed your concerns about administrative boundaries. We did, but I think you need to know that I'm aware of what's really happening here. The basement laboratory, Meridian Research Solutions, the experimental procedures. James stepped into the office and closed the door behind him. I also know about Timothy Morrison. Dr. Hollins went completely still, the color draining from her face. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she slowly set down her pen and looked directly at James with eyes that held years of guilt and fear. How much do you know? She asked quietly. Everything. The financial records, the patient deaths, the cover-ups. Rita Caldwell has been documenting the entire operation for 2 years. James sat down across from her desk. But what I learned today changes everything. You're not the mastermind of this conspiracy. You're another victim. Dr. Hollins laughed bitterly. A victim? Mr. Curtis, I've supervised the torture and murder of dozens of innocent people. I've falsified medical records, lied to families, and participated in systematic genocide. Whatever Morrison is holding over me doesn't excuse what I've done, but it explains it. And it might give us a way to stop him. Us? Dr. Hollins shook her head. Mr. Curtis, you have no idea what you're suggesting. Morrison isn't just a hospital administrator with gambling debts. He has connections to organized crime, corrupt officials, and pharmaceutical executives who view human lives as acceptable business expenses. I know. But he's also a grieving father who's been using his son's death to justify increasingly monstrous behavior. And you're a doctor who's been forced to violate everything you believed in because of one terrible mistake. Dr. Hollins was quiet for a long time, staring at a framed medical diploma on her wall, a symbol of the oath she'd taken to first do no harm. Timothy Morrison was 8 years old, she said finally. Bright, curious, excited about starting 3rd grade. I killed him because I was careless, because I didn't double-check his medical history. And Frank Morrison has been making you pay for that mistake ever since. He approached me 6 months after Timothy's death, when the malpractice lawsuit was destroying my career. Offered me a position at Riverside, a chance to start over, financial support for legal expenses. Dr. Hollins's voice was hollow, mechanical. I thought he was being generous, helping me rebuild my life. I didn't realize he was setting a trap. When did you learn about the experimental program? Morrison introduced me to Dr. Reeves from Meridian Research about a year after I started at Riverside. Said it was an opportunity to advance psychiatric medicine and provide cutting-edge treatments to underserved populations. The first few patients were genuinely volunteers from our chronic care ward people who weren't responding to conventional therapy. James listened, understanding how she'd been gradually drawn into increasingly unethical activities. When did it become clearly illegal? When the first patient died during trials, and Morrison instructed me to falsify the death certificate. When I objected, he showed me video recordings of my conversations with patients, audio tapes of me discussing Timothy Morrison's case, and copies of the altered medical records from Boston. Dr. Hollins's hands were shaking as she spoke. He made it clear that if I didn't cooperate, he would destroy what remained of my career and ensure I faced criminal charges for Timothy's death. But you continued to participate even after that. What choice did I have? Morrison gradually increased the scope of the program, selecting more vulnerable patients, approving more dangerous experimental protocols. Each time I tried to object, he reminded me of Timothy and threatened to expose everything I'd done. James leaned forward. Dr. Hollins, you do have a choice now. Help us expose Morrison and Meridian Research Solutions. Testify about the blackmail, the experimental procedures, the systematic murder of patients, and go to prison for the rest of my life? Face charges for dozens of deaths? Dr. Hollins shook her head. Mr. Curtis, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm trapped. Morrison has made sure of that. Maybe not. Rita Caldwell has documented evidence that proves Morrison forced your participation through blackmail. Federal prosecutors might be willing to offer immunity in exchange for your testimony against the real criminals. Dr. Hollins stared at James. For a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. You said Rita has been documenting everything for 2 years? Photographs, audio recordings, financial records, medical documentation. Everything needed to prove this entire conspiracy. Including evidence of Morrison's blackmail? Yes. Ritter recorded conversations between you and Morrison where he explicitly threatened you with exposure of the Timothy Morrison case. For the first time since James had known her, Dr. Hollins looked hopeful. If that's true, if there's really evidence that I was coerced, there is. But we need to act quickly. Morrison is planning to select 10 more patients for the next round of experiments, and Rita says he's also planning to eliminate me as a threat. Dr. Hollins stood up and walked to her office window, looking out at the patient recreation areas where vulnerable people trusted the hospital to provide healing rather than harm. Mr. Curtis, if I help you expose this conspiracy, those 10 patients can be saved. But hundreds of others will have died because I was too cowardly to act sooner. The choice isn't between saving everyone or saving no one, James said gently. The choice is between saving the people you still can or letting Morrison continue to use you to hurt more innocent victims. Dr. Hollins turned back to face James, and he could see years of guilt and fear warring with a desperate hope for redemption. What would you need me to do? Help us gather final evidence of Morrison's operation. Document the selection process for the next group of patients. Provide inside access to Morrison's communications with Meridian Research. James paused. And, when the time comes, testify about everything Morrison forced you to do. Dr. Hollins was quiet for nearly a minute, weighing her options. Finally, she nodded slowly. Mr. Curtis, I've been living in hell for 3 years, knowing that every day I remained silent. More people died because of my cowardice. If there's a chance to stop Morrison and save even one life, I have to take it, even if it means risking everything. Especially then, Dr. Hollins replied. It's time I honored the oath I took as a doctor instead of the threats Frank Morrison has been holding over me. As James left Dr. Hollins's office, he realized that their unlikely alliance might actually have a chance of stopping the conspiracy. But he also knew that Morrison would never allow them to expose his operation without a fight, and that the next few days would determine whether justice prevailed, or whether more innocent people would disappear into the basement laboratory. Forever, the abandoned chapel at Riverside Mental Health hadn't been used for services in over a decade, but it remained unlocked as a quiet space for families and staff. At 7 p.m. on Thursday evening, James Curtis, Rita Caldwell, and Dr. Margaret Hollins met among the dusty pews and faded religious icons to plan their assault on Morrison's conspiracy. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. 3 people seeking redemption in a place of worship, surrounded by medical equipment and religious symbols. That represented both healing and judgment. Morrison is accelerating the timeline, Dr. Hollins reported, her voice echoing softly in the empty chapel. He met with Dr. Reeves this afternoon and confirmed that the next transport is scheduled for Monday morning. 10 patients selected from the criteria we discussed. Rita, looking frailer than ever but determined, spread her documentation across a wooden pew. I've identified 8 of the 10 patients from monitoring Morrison's selection process, all from the dementia ward, are chronic depression cases with minimal family contact. James studied the list of names, feeling sick at the clinical way these vulnerable people had been targeted. Do any of them have family members or social workers who would notice if they disappeared? That's the problem, Dr. Hollins replied. Morrison has become very sophisticated about selecting patients who won't be missed. These are people who've been essentially abandoned by the system and their families. Which makes it even more important that we stop this, Rita said firmly. If we don't advocate for them, no one will. James outlined the plan he'd developed over the past 24 hours. We need irrefutable evidence that will force immediate federal intervention. Rita's documentation proves the historical pattern, but we need to catch them in the act of preparing patients for transport. I can provide access to Morrison's communications with Meridian Research, Dr. Hollins offered. He's been increasingly careless about digital security, sending emails from his office computer that detail the logistics of patient transfers. And I can monitor the basement laboratory preparation, Rita added. As the senior night nurse, I have legitimate access to all areas of the hospital during overnight shifts. James felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. I've contacted Sarah's friend at the Washington Post. She's prepared to publish the story immediately once we provide final confirmation of active patient trafficking. I've also reached out to an FBI field office through intermediaries. They're standing by for evidence of federal crimes. Dr. Hollins looked nervous. Mr. Curtis, you need to understand that once we trigger this exposure, Morrison will know immediately that I've betrayed him. He's already suspicious of my loyalty, and he has contingency plans for eliminating threats. What kind of contingency? Plans? The same kind that killed David Chun. Morrison has connections to people who specialize in making problems disappear permanently. Dr. Hollins's voice was steady, but James could see fear in her eyes. If we're going to do this, we need To be prepared for the possibility that we won't survive to see justice served, Ritter reached across the pew to squeeze Dr. Hollins's hand. Margaret, we're all going to die eventually. I have cancer. You have Morrison's blackmail hanging over you, and James has already been marked as a threat. The question is whether our deaths will mean something or whether there'll just be more casualties in Morrison's operation. The use of Dr. Hollins's first name marked a shift in their relationship, from professional distance to personal alliance, forged by shared desperation and moral purpose. There's something else, Dr. Hollins said quietly. Morrison has been receiving pressure from Meridian Research to expand the program beyond Riverside. They want to establish experimental facilities at 5 other state hospitals within the next year, potentially affecting thousands of vulnerable patients. James felt his blood run cold. This isn't just about saving 10 people or stopping one hospital's crimes. This is about preventing a systematic program of human experimentation across multiple states. Exactly? Which is why we can't afford to fail. Dr. Hollins pulled a manila envelope from her purse. I've been documenting Morrison's expansion plans, including the names of hospital administrators he's been recruiting and the financial incentives Meridian Research is offering. The envelope contained correspondence that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Morrison wasn't just running a local operation. He was developing a business model for exploiting mentally ill patients throughout the healthcare system. The potential victim count wasn't in the hundreds, but in the thousands. We need to coordinate our evidence gathering for maximum impact, James said, understanding that they would have only one chance to expose the full conspiracy. Rita, can you access the basement laboratory during Monday's patient preparation? Without arousing suspicion? Yes. I can document the actual procedures they use to prepare patients for transport, including the sedation protocols and consent documentation that Meridian Research requires. Dr. Hollins, can you record Morrison's final communications with Dr. Reeves about the Monday transport? I can do better than that. Morrison has a meeting scheduled with Dr. Reeves on Sunday evening to finalize logistics. I can suggest that we meet in his office, where I know he keeps recording equipment for his own protection. James reviewed their timeline. So we have 3 days to gather final evidence, coordinate with federal authorities and media contacts, and document an active patient trafficking operation, while avoiding getting murdered by Morrison's criminal associates, Rita added with dark humor. Don't forget that part. Dr. Hollins stood up and walked to the front of the chapel, where a simple wooden cross hung above a dusty altar. You know, I became a doctor because I wanted to heal people, to honor the trust that patients place in medical professionals. Morrison has used my guilt and fear to turn me into the opposite of everything I believed in. But you're choosing to honor that trust now, James said, even though it might cost you everything, maybe especially because it might cost me everything. Dr. Hollins turned back to face them. If we succeed, hundreds or thousands of vulnerable people will be protected from what Morrison and Meridian Research have planned. If we fail, we won't fail, Rita interrupted. We can't afford to fail. As they prepared to leave the chapel, Dr. Hollins made one final revelation that changed their understanding of Morrison's motivations. There's something I haven't told you about Timothy Morrison's death. It wasn't just medical malpractice. Morrison believes I killed his son deliberately as part of some larger conspiracy. What do you mean? Morrison has convinced himself that pharmaceutical companies and medical professionals are systematically murdering children to suppress alternative treatments or cover up vaccine injuries. In his mind, the experimental program at Riverside isn't just about money, it's about revenge against a medical system he believes murdered his child. James stared at Dr. Hollins in shock. You're saying Morrison thinks he's justified in what he's doing? I'm saying Morrison has turned his grief into a weapon, and he won't stop until he's destroyed everyone he holds responsible for his son's death, including me, including the patients he's experimenting on, and now including anyone who tries to stop him. As they walked out of the chapel into the cool evening air, James realized they weren't just fighting a conspiracy motivated by greed. They were confronting a man whose grief had transformed him into something far more dangerous than a simple criminal. The question was whether their alliance of guilt, desperation, and moral purpose would be strong enough to stop Morrison before his twisted sense of justice claimed more innocent lives. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of bone-deep chill that seemed to seep through the walls of Riverside Mental Health. James Curtis arrived at work early, knowing this would be either the day they exposed Morrison's conspiracy, or the day they all disappeared permanently. The plan was in motion. Rita had worked the overnight shift, documenting the preparation of 10 patients in the basement laboratory. Dr. Hollins had scheduled a morning meeting with Morrison to discuss final logistics for the patient transport. James had coordinated with federal authorities and media contacts, providing them with preliminary evidence and promising definitive proof by evening got. But as James settled into his office and reviewed the day's schedule, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. His name had been added to the transport list. J. Curtis, administrative transfer, special handling required, appeared on the manifest for the afternoon transport to Meridian Research Solutions. Morrison wasn't just planning to silence him. He was planning to make him disappear into the experimental program. James's hands shook as he photographed the transport list with his phone. The message was clear. Morrison knew about their plan and was accelerating his timeline to eliminate all threats simultaneously. At 9:30 a.m., James received a text from Rita. Something's wrong. They've moved up the timeline. Patients being prepped for immediate transport. Instead of the planned afternoon pickup, Morrison was moving the patients to Meridian Research that morning. James realized they had hours, not the full day they'd anticipated, to gather final evidence and trigger federal intervention. James hurried to Dr. Hollins's office, finding her reviewing patient files with unusual intensity. When he knocked, she looked up with eyes that held the same fear he was feeling. "Morrison knows," she said simply. "He asked me direct questions about my conversations with you and Rita. He's suspicious enough to accelerate everything. I saw the transport list. He's planning to include me in the patient transfer." Dr. Hollins went pale. "James, if you're on that transport, you won't survive the first week of experimental procedures. Morrison has instructed Dr. Reeves to use you as a test subject for their most dangerous compounds. Then we need to move now." "Where's Morrison?" "Meeting with Dr. Reeves in the basement laboratory, reviewing the patients and finalizing transport." "Logistics." "They're planning to move everyone within the next 2 hours." James made a decision that he knew was probably suicidal, but represented their only chance of success. "Dr. Hollins, I need you to get me access to that meeting. I need to record Morrison and Dr. Reeves discussing the illegal transport and experimental procedures." "That's impossible. They're meeting in a secure area that requires special authorization. If Morrison sees you there, he'll kill me. But if we don't get proof of active patient trafficking, the federal authorities won't have grounds for immediate intervention. Those 10 patients will disappear, and Morrison will just move his operation to another hospital." Dr. Hollins was quiet for a long moment, weighing their options. "There might be a way. I can tell Morrison that you've agreed to cooperate in exchange for being transferred to administrative duties at another facility, that you want to meet with Dr. Reeves to discuss your new position. Will he believe that?" Morrison is arrogant enough to think that fear and money can buy anyone's silence. "If I present it as you being willing to become part of the conspiracy rather than expose it, he might see it as an opportunity to control you more effectively." James understood the risk. If Morrison didn't believe the deception, James would be walking directly into a trap. But if they didn't act immediately, those patients would be subjected to procedures that had already killed dozens of others. "Do it," James said. "Set up the meeting." While Dr. Hollins contacted Morrison, James sent emergency messages to his federal and media contacts, alerting them that the situation was accelerating and requesting immediate response. He also sent a final message to Sarah, telling her he loved her and asking her to make sure their story was told if he didn't survive the day. 20 minutes later, Dr. Hollins returned with Morrison's response. He agreed to the meeting, but he's suspicious. He wants to see you in the basement laboratory in 30 minutes, where he can control the environment and ensure you're not recording anything. James activated the recording app on his phone and concealed the device in an interior jacket pocket. Dr. Hollins, if something goes wrong, if Morrison realizes what we're doing, you need to get to the federal authorities immediately with Rita's documentation. James, I should be the one taking this risk. This whole situation exists because of my cowardice and mistakes, and now you're helping to fix it. That matters more than who takes the final risk. As James prepared to descend to the basement laboratory, Rita appeared in the hallway, looking exhausted but determined. I've documented everything I could about the patient preparation procedures. For sedation, forged consent forms, experimental, drug protocols that aren't approved for human testing. Rita, you need to get out of the hospital immediately. Morrison knows we've been working together. I'm not leaving until this is finished. Those patients downstairs have no one else to advocate for them. James looked at Rita and Dr. Hollins, a dying nurse and a blackmailed doctor who had found the courage to risk everything for people who couldn't protect themselves. If this goes wrong, make sure the evidence gets to the right people. Don't let Morrison cover this up. The basement felt colder than usual as James descended the stairs, his heart pounding with each step. The sterile white corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, lined with rooms full of patients who were about to be transported to almost certain death. James could hear voices from the main laboratory, Morrison's aggressive tone, and another man's voice with a slight European accent that must belong to Dr. Reeves. They were discussing logistics, timelines, and patient conditions with the casual efficiency of people arranging a business transaction. As James approached the laboratory entrance, he realized he was about to either gather the evidence needed to save hundreds of lives or walk directly into Morrison's trap. The recording device in his pocket felt like both a weapon and a suicide note. The laboratory door opened, and Morrison appeared with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Curtis, so good of you to join us. Dr. Reeves is very interested in discussing your future with our organization. James stepped into the laboratory, surrounded by the experimental equipment and unconscious patients that represented Morrison's twisted vision of justice. In the next few minutes, he would either expose the entire conspiracy or become its next victim. The only question was whether anyone would hear his recording before Morrison silenced him permanently. The basement laboratory was a nightmare of clinical efficiency. Rows of hospital beds contained unconscious patients, each connected to IV drips that fed experimental compounds into their systems. Monitoring equipment tracked vital signs while researchers in white coats took notes on clipboards. Treating human suffering as data points in the research, Dr. Alexander Reeves was exactly what James had expected. Tall, impeccably dressed, with the cold demeanor of someone who viewed people as laboratory specimens. He extended a manicured hand to James with the practiced smile of a pharmaceutical executive. Mr. Curtis, Frank has told me so much about you. Your attention to detail and discretion are exactly what our expanding operation requires. James shook Reeves's hand, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to run. Dr. Reeves, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss how I might contribute to your research program. Morrison moved to stand between James and the laboratory exit, his presence making it clear that leaving wasn't an option. Dr. Reeves, James has been asking questions about our patient transfer protocols. I thought it would be beneficial for him to see the important work we're doing here. Excellent idea. Dr. Reeves gestured toward the rows of patients. Mr. Curtis, what you're seeing represents the cutting edge of psychiatric pharmaceutical research. These subjects are contributing to treatments that could revolutionize mental health care. James forced himself to look at the patients, recognizing several faces from the hospital's general population. Thomas Brennan was in the nearest bed, unconscious and connected to multiple monitoring devices. His skin had a grayish pallor that suggested the experimental compounds were already affecting his organ function. The subjects seemed to be experiencing significant physical stress, James observed, hoping to provoke Morrison and Reeves into revealing details about their procedures. Temporary side effects, Reeves replied dismissively. Phase 2 trials for neurological compounds often produce initial adverse reactions. The mortality rate has been quite acceptable for this stage of research. What constitutes an acceptable mortality rate? James asked, his phone recording every word. Morrison stepped closer, his eyes narrowing slightly. James, Dr. Reeves is sharing proprietary information with you as a potential team member. I trust you understand the confidential nature of this discussion. Of course. I'm just trying to understand the scope of the operation. Reeves seemed pleased by James's apparent interest. We've processed over 300 subjects through various trial phases over the past 2 years. Mortality rates vary. By compound, some experimental drugs have killed only 8 to 10% of subjects, while others have reached 25 to 30%, all within FDA guidelines for Phase 2 trials. FDA guidelines for voluntary participants with informed consent, James said carefully. These patients don't appear to be conscious enough to provide consent. Morrison's expression darkened. James, these are state hospital patients with severe mental illness who haven't responded to conventional treatment. Their families have essentially abandoned them, and society has written them off as lost causes. We're giving their lives meaning by contributing to medical advancement. By experimenting on them without their knowledge or consent? The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Morrison exchanged a look with Reeves that confirmed James's worst suspicions. They had never intended for him to leave this laboratory alive. Mr. Curtis, Reeves said slowly, I'm beginning to think Frank was right about your inappropriate curiosity about our procedures. James realized the deception was failing and decided to abandon any pretense of cooperation. Dr. Reeves, what you're describing is systematic murder disguised as medical research. These people are being tortured and killed because they can't defend themselves. Morrison pulled a pistol from his jacket, pointing it directly at James's chest. I knew you were too much of a bleeding heart to understand the bigger picture. David Chun had the same problem. So you killed him. David Chun was going to destroy years of important research because he couldn't see past his sentimental attachment to individual subjects. Just like you, Morrison's voice was filled with the righteous anger of someone who believed his cause justified any atrocity. Reeves moved to a computer terminal and began typing. Frank, we need to accelerate the timeline. If Mr. Curtis has been gathering information about our operation, there may be others who pose similar threats. Already handled, Morrison replied. Rita Caldwell will suffer a tragic medication error during her shift tonight. Dr. Hollins will experience a convenient car accident on her drive home. 3 problems solved permanently. James felt rage building in his chest. These men were planning to murder Rita and Dr. Hollins with the same casual efficiency they used to select experimental subjects. You're both psychopaths. You've turned a mental health facility into a death camp. We've turned a drain on society into a resource for medical advancement, Morrison shot back. These people were going to die anyway, forgotten, abandoned, meaningless. We've given their deaths purpose. Timothy Morrison was 8 years old, James said, understanding that Morrison's grief had twisted into something monstrous. Your son would be horrified by what you've become. Morrison's face went white with fury. "Don't you dare speak about my son. Timothy died because the medical establishment failed him, just like they fail everyone who doesn't fit their profit models. This research will prevent other children from suffering his fate by torturing vulnerable adults who remind you of the system that killed him." Morrison raised the pistol, his hand shaking with rage. "You have no idea what loss feels like." "What?" "It's like to watch your child die because doctors are too arrogant to admit their mistakes." James realized that Morrison wasn't just a greedy administrator. He was a broken father whose grief had transformed him into the very kind of medical monster he believed had killed his son. "Timothy wouldn't want you to hurt innocent people in his name. Timothy is dead because of people like Dr. Hollins, people like you who think patients are just paperwork to be processed efficiently. This research will expose the corruption in the medical system and provide treatments that actually help people instead of just generating profits." Dr. Reeves moved away from the computer terminal. "Frank, we need to dispose of Mr. Curtis and accelerate the patient transport. I have federal inspectors arriving at our facility tomorrow, and we can't afford any complications." As Morrison prepared to pull the trigger, James heard something that gave him hope: footsteps in the hallway outside the laboratory, moving with purpose and urgency. Either his federal contacts had arrived, or Morrison's security team was coming to dispose of additional threats. "Mr. Curtis," Morrison said with deadly calm, "you're about to become the first subject in a very special experimental protocol, one that will test exactly how much pain the human nervous system can endure." James realized he had seconds to act before Morrison and Reeves turned him into another victim of their twisted research program. The recording on his phone had captured enough evidence to expose the entire conspiracy, if anyone ever found it. The laboratory door burst open, and James prepared for either salvation or the arrival of Morrison's accomplices to help torture him to death. The laboratory door exploded inward as FBI agents in tactical gear flooded the room, their weapons trained on Morrison and Dr. Reeves. "Federal agents! Drop your weapons and get on the ground." Morrison spun toward the agents, his pistol still pointed at James, confusion and rage warring on his face. "How did you?" "Drop the weapon now." Agent Sarah Chun, no relation to David Chun, but the irony wasn't lost on James, stepped forward with her sidearm drawn. "Frank Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and human trafficking." Dr. Reeves raised his hands slowly, the clinical detachment never leaving his face even as his illegal operation crumbled around him. "Officers, I believe there's been some misunderstanding. We're conducting legitimate pharmaceutical research under proper protocols." "Shut up," Morrison snarled at Reeves, then turned back to the FBI agents. "You have no idea what you're interrupting. This research could save thousands of lives, could expose the medical corruption that's been killing patients for decades." Agent Chun kept her weapon trained on Morrison, while other agents moved to secure the laboratory. "Mr. Morrison, put down the gun. You're surrounded, and your facility is being seized as evidence of federal crimes." James realized this was his chance to provide the agents with crucial information. "Agent Chun, Dr. Reeves just admitted to experimenting on over 300 patients with mortality rates up to 30%. Morrison confessed to murdering David Chun and planning to kill Rita Caldwell and Dr. Hollins. You recorded this conversation?" Agent Chun asked. James pulled his phone from his jacket pocket, showing the recording app that had been running throughout the confrontation. Everything. The patient trafficking, the experimental procedures, the planned murders. Morrison's face twisted with desperation. "You don't understand? These people were going to die anyway, abandoned by their families, forgotten by society. We gave their deaths meaning by torturing them without consent," James replied. "By treating human beings like laboratory animals." Dr. Reeves remained silent as agents moved to handcuff him, but Morrison continued ranting as they forced him to the ground. My son died because of medical arrogance and corruption. This research was going to expose that system and provide real treatments instead of profit-driven placebos. Agent Chun secured Morrison's weapon and began reading him his rights. Frank Morrison, you're under arrest for multiple counts of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, human trafficking, and violations of federal drug trafficking laws. As the agents worked to secure the crime scene, James moved through the laboratory, checking on the unconscious patients. Thomas Brennan was alive but barely responsive, his vital signs showing the strain of experimental compounds coursing through his system. Other patients showed varying degrees of physical deterioration from weeks or months of illegal medical procedures. These people need immediate medical attention, James told Agent Chun. They've been subjected to experimental drugs that aren't approved for human testing. Medical teams are en route, she replied. We've also secured the upper levels of the hospital and arrested 3 accomplices who were preparing to eliminate witnesses. James felt relief wash over him. Rita Caldwell and Dr. Hollins, are they safe? Ms. Caldwell is in protective custody and providing additional evidence. Dr. Hollins is cooperating fully and has been granted immunity in exchange for her testimony about Morrison's blackmail and coercion. As paramedics arrived to treat the experimental subjects, James learned the full scope of the federal operation. His early morning messages to authorities had triggered a coordinated response involving the FBI, and federal prosecutors. The evidence he, Rita, and Dr. Hollins had gathered provided probable cause for search warrants and immediate intervention. Dr. Reeves, maintaining his clinical demeanor even in handcuffs, made one final attempt to justify their actions. Agent Chun, you're destroying research that could revolutionize psychiatric treatment. These subjects were terminal cases who contributed to medical advancement that will benefit millions of people. These subjects were human beings with names, families, and rights, James replied. Patricia Mooney was a grieving widow who deserved compassion, not experimental torture. Thomas Brennan was a man mourning his wife who trusted this hospital to help him heal. Rita Caldwell appeared in the laboratory doorway, supported by medical personnel, but insisting on witnessing Morrison's arrest. Her face was pale, but determined as she watched federal agents document the evidence she'd spent 2 years gathering. Rita, James said, moving to her side. You did it. You saved them. We saved them, she corrected, her voice weak but triumphant. And we prevented Morrison from expanding this nightmare to other hospitals. Dr. Hollins entered the laboratory behind Rita, tears streaming down her face as she saw the patients being prepared for emergency medical transport. I'm so sorry, she whispered to Thomas Brennan as paramedics worked to stabilize his condition. I should have stopped this years ago. Agent Chun approached James as the crime scene processing continued. Mr. Curtis, your evidence and testimony will be crucial for prosecuting this case. Are you prepared to testify in federal court about what you witnessed? Absolutely. Morrison and Reeves need to face justice for what they've done. And the families of the victims deserve to know the truth about what happened to their loved ones. As Morrison and Dr. Reeves were led away in handcuffs, Morrison made one final outburst. You think you've won something here? The medical system is still corrupt, still killing patients for profit. This research was the only way to expose that truth. James watched Morrison disappear up the basement stairs, understanding that grief and loss had transformed a father's love into something monstrous. Timothy Morrison's death had been a tragedy, but it didn't justify the systematic torture and murder of vulnerable patients who trusted the hospital to provide healing. Over the following hours, the full scope of Morrison's operation became clear. Federal agents discovered financial records showing that Meridian Research Solutions had paid over $12 million for access to experimental subjects. Correspondence revealed plans to expand the program to 8 other state hospitals, potentially. affecting thousands of vulnerable patients. Most importantly, they found evidence that Morrison's conspiracy had resulted in the deaths of at least 73 patients over 2 years, people who'd been reported as successful discharges or transfers, but had actually died during illegal medical experiments. As James finally left Riverside Mental Health that evening, he realized that their desperate gamble had not only exposed Morrison's conspiracy, but prevented a much larger tragedy. The experimental program that had been planned for other hospitals would never materialize, and hundreds of vulnerable patients would remain safe from pharmaceutical companies willing to treat human beings as disposable test subjects. Rita Caldwell had been right about one thing: sometimes the only way to honor the dead was to risk everything to protect the living. And sometimes, even in the darkest places, people found the courage to choose redemption over self-preservation. 6 months later, James Curtis walked up the marble steps of the federal courthouse in downtown Boston, flanked by Sarah Martinez and a team of federal prosecutors. The media attention had been intense. The Riverside Mental Health scandal had exposed systematic abuse of vulnerable patients and sparked congressional hearings on oversight of state psychiatric facilities. Today was the final day of testimony in United States v. Morrison, a case that had become a landmark prosecution for medical crimes and human trafficking. Frank Morrison faced life in prison without parole for his role in the deaths of 73 patients. Dr. Alexander Reeves had already been sentenced to 45 years for conspiracy and murder. 3 other Meridian Research executives awaited trial in separate proceedings. Inside the courthouse, James took his place at the witness stand for the final time. Over the past months, he'd testified about discovering the pattern of patient disappearances, witnessing the basement laboratory, and recording Morrison's confession. His evidence had been crucial in establishing the scope and intent of the conspiracy. The prosecution's final questions focused on the human cost of Morrison's operation. Mr. Curtis, in your assessment, how many additional patients would have been subjected to illegal experimentation if this conspiracy hadn't been exposed? James looked directly at the jury. Based on correspondence we found in Morrison's files, Meridian Research Solutions planned to expand to 8 other state hospitals within 2 years. Each facility would have processed approximately 200 patients annually through various experimental protocols. Conservative estimates suggest over 3,000 vulnerable people would have been subjected to procedures with mortality rates exceeding 20%. And the expansion was prevented by your actions and those of your colleagues. By the actions of Rita Caldwell, who documented evidence for 2 years despite personal risk. By Dr. Margaret Hollins, who found the courage to break free from Morrison's blackmail and help expose his crimes. And by federal agents who acted swiftly on the evidence we provided. Morrison's defense attorney attempted a final cross-examination, trying to portray his client as a grieving father driven to extremes by medical malpractice. But James's recorded conversation with Morrison had captured his confession to murder and his delusional justification for torturing innocent patients. Mr. Curtis, my client lost his 8-year-old son due to medical negligence. Don't you think grief and trauma might have impaired his judgment? James had anticipated this question and prepared his response carefully. Grief is understandable. Using that grief to justify the systematic torture and murder of dozens of innocent people is not. Timothy Morrison deserved better than having his memory used to rationalize the very kind of medical cruelty his father claimed to oppose. After 3 hours of testimony, James was dismissed from the witness stand. As he walked past Morrison's table, the former hospital administrator stared at him with eyes that still burned with righteous fury. Even facing life in prison, Morrison remained convinced that his actions had been justified. Outside the courthouse, James was met by Thomas Brennan, who had made remarkable recovery after months of medical treatment to counter the effects of experimental drugs. The elderly man's cognitive function had largely returned, though he still struggled with short-term memory issues related to the chemical compounds he'd been exposed to. "James," Thomas said, gripping his hand firmly, "I wanted to thank you before the verdict comes in. You gave me back my life and my dignity. Thomas, you're the one who first tried to warn me about what was happening. Your courage in that basement window started everything. Maybe, but you're the one who listened when everyone else would have dismissed the ravings of a confused old man." Rita Caldwell approached them, walking slowly but steadily. Her cancer treatment had been successful, and doctors now gave her a prognosis of several years rather than weeks. She'd used her recovery time to become a national advocate for patient rights and oversight of medical research. "Any word on Dr. Hollins?" Rita asked. "She testified this morning," James replied. "Her cooperation agreement includes community service at a veterans hospital and permanent surrender of her medical license. She'll never practice medicine again, but she won't face prison time." "Good," Rita said. "Margaret made terrible choices, but Morrison exploited her guilt and fear. She deserves a chance at redemption." The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning with their verdict. Frank Morrison was found guilty on all counts, 73 counts, of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, human trafficking, and federal drug trafficking violations. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole. As Morrison was led away in shackles, he turned toward the gallery where James, Rita, and Thomas sat with families of other victims. "You think you've won justice here, but the medical system is still corrupt. People are still dying because of corporate greed and medical arrogance." Thomas Brennan stood up slowly, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "Mr. Morrison, people were dying because of you. Because you decided that your grief gave you permission to torture innocent patients who trusted us to help them heal." 6 months after Morrison's sentencing, James received a letter that brought the story full circle. The state of Massachusetts had appointed him as Director of Patient Advocacy for reformed Riverside Mental Health, now operating under federal oversight with comprehensive patient protection protocols. The basement laboratory had been converted into a memorial garden for the victims of Morrison's conspiracy. A simple plaque listed the names of the 73 patients who had died during illegal experiments, along with a commitment that their deaths would not be forgotten or repeated. On the anniversary of Morrison's arrest, James stood in that memorial garden with Sarah, who had become his wife 3 months earlier. Rita Caldwell had passed away peacefully the previous winter, but not before seeing comprehensive federal legislation passed to prevent future medical experimentation on vulnerable populations. Dr. Hollins had written James a letter from the veterans hospital where she now worked in administration, helping to coordinate legitimate medical care for former service members. Her letter expressed gratitude for the chance at redemption and a promise to spend her remaining years honoring the patients she had failed to protect. As James and Sarah walked through the memorial garden, reading the names of Morrison's victims, they reflected on how ordinary people could find extraordinary courage when confronted with systematic evil. Rita Caldwell had documented evidence despite terminal cancer. Dr. Hollins had broken free from years of blackmail to expose corruption. Thomas Brennan had risked his life to warn others about ongoing abuse. Do you think Morrison will ever understand what he really did? Sarah asked. James considered the question, remembering Morrison's final outburst in the courtroom. "I think Frank Morrison will die believing he was a righteous crusader fighting medical corruption. He'll never acknowledge that grief transformed him into the very kind of monster he claimed to oppose." And the patients who survived? They're healing, not just from the physical effects of the experimental drugs, but from the knowledge that someone finally listened to them, believed them, and fought for their dignity. As the sun set over the memorial garden, James understood that justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about honoring the victims, protecting the vulnerable, and ensuring that institutional power could never again be used to exploit people who trusted the system to care for them. The White Room was gone forever, replaced by gardens where patients could heal in safety and dignity. And in that transformation, the memory of Morrison's victims had found its own kind of redemption.